I would now like to turn it over, please, to the Native Women's Association of Canada.
Good morning. I'd like to start off by introducing Native Women's Association representatives here today. Leslie Spillett. Leslie is a Cree from Wekusko in Manitoba, and she sits on the board of directors of the Native Women's Association of Canada. And Elisa Johnson is Ojibwe from the Hiawatha First Nation, and she's an employee of the Native Women's Association of Canada. My name is Sharon McIver, and I'm been working with Native women's issues for about a few years now, probably about 35, and have been involved along the way with the Native women in prison issues. Along with Trish, sat on the working group of the Task Force on Federally Sentenced Women and helped put together the Making Choices report. Also was involved with the Native Women's Association, on behalf of the Native Women's Association of Canada, in the construction and operation of the Okomaochi Healing Lodge, located on the Nittany First Nation, just out of Maple Creek in southern Saskatchewan. And like Trish, have outlived many of my sisters, much younger than myself, that have been incarcerated. The Native Women's Association of Canada is an Aboriginal women's organization, and we represent Aboriginal women across Canada. The provincial and territorial member associations come from every province and territory in Canada. The organization officially has been in place since 1973, although women working on Aboriginal issues predate that by a long time, because up until 1952, as Aboriginal people, we weren't considered as persons. The Native Women's Association of Canada has several issues that they want to bring to the attention of the Human Rights Commission. We will summarize our issues in a series of, first, we want the decarceration of Aboriginal women in the prison system. Because of the rampant racism within the criminal justice system at all levels, it's led to the increase in the number of Aboriginal women incarcerated federally from 15% in '84 to 27% today. NWAC is asking for the decarceration of Aboriginal women within the Canadian penitentiary system. NWAC would like to explore with Canada, CSC, and other interested parties alternatives to incarceration, including the use of Section 81 to establish community-based healing facilities for all Aboriginal women prisoners, including those classified as maximum security. We'd like capacity building in Aboriginal communities to facilitate reintegration of Aboriginal women prisoners back into Aboriginal society. If Aboriginal women prisoners within the Canadian penitentiary system are to be decarcerated beginning in the near future and over a period of years, the shorter the better, Canada needs to invest financial resources at the Aboriginal community level to build the capacity of those communities to reintegrate Aboriginal women prisoners within their communities and their families. Such capacity building can use federal dollars already targeted for Aboriginal community use, including job creation, training, employment, economic development, social services, health, and so on. Crime prevention dollars and Department of Justice grants and contributions have also been made available to community projects. Native Women's Association of Canada requests that some of these funds and a new special fund aimed at Aboriginal female integration and community capacity building be aimed at Aboriginal women's representative organizations to facilitate the process. We'd like the facilitation implementation of sections 81 and 84 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act for the benefit of Aboriginal women prisoners. The Native Women's Association of Canada has worked with CSC to implement sections 81 and 84 unsuccessfully. The Native Women's Association of Canada proposes the establishment of a joint Native Women's Association of Canada, a government representative planning committee on section 81 and 84 to set target dates for a plan of action to implement these sections, aimed at bringing Aboriginal women prisoners under Aboriginal jurisdiction for healing and reintegration. The Native Women's Association of Canada wants compensation for Aboriginal women prisoners for CSC's breach of fiduciary obligations owed to them. The Native Women's Association of Canada proposes the establishment of an office headed by an Aboriginal woman lawyer/judge criminologist, supported by CSC staff and Aboriginal professionals, to remedy the breach of CSC of its fiduciary duty to Aboriginal women prisoners, with a final report to the Minister, the Solicitor General, and the Canadian Human Rights Commission for implementation. The Native Women's Association of Canada would like standardization of the treatment of federal Aboriginal women prisoners in British Columbia and any other incarceral situation that is governed under an exchange of service kind of agreement. The incarceration of federal Aboriginal prisoners in these facilities needs to be standardized with the treatment of federal women prisoners elsewhere within the federal system, to ensure that they receive adequate and meaningful programming and humane treatment without discrimination based on federal or Aboriginal status. Although this is not yet happening elsewhere in Canada, as evidenced by this human rights complaint, the return of federal women prisoners in BC to the jurisdiction of CSC and the planned move from BCCW to Sumas Centre provides a unique opportunity in BC to remedy the situation and provide an improved implementation model for the rest of the country. I want to elaborate just a little on some of the points. Well, federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners are serving time in CSC facilities, whether in women's regional prisons or provincial institutions or men's federal prisons. They are entitled under the CCRA to specific programming for Aboriginal offenders and entitled to programs available to federally sentenced women. Aboriginal female elders and spiritual leaders have been sporadically employed to provide spiritual services and guidance to the federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners at the Healing Lodge in Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, and at other 4 regional female correctional facilities. The Okama-Ochi Healing Lodge was recommended by the federally sentenced Women Task Force report, Creating Choices. It was built following a vision of the Healing Lodge Planning Circle, a group of primarily Aboriginal men and women who directed the original operations of the lodge. The Planning Circle designed an operating structure that included a governing council called the Kagawan Kanawak. The Kagawan Kanawak means keepers of the vision. The Kagawan Kanawak was to oversee the operation of the Healing Lodge. However, CSC reduced the function of this governing body to that of an advisory board. As a result, the Okama-Ochi Healing Lodge exists as a facility that is basically Aboriginal in name only. Elders and cultural spiritual people have also been employed to provide some spiritual services to federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners serving time in provincial prisons and in men's federal prisons. The Aboriginal elders are supposedly put on the same footing as other spiritual advisors, including priests, Protestant clergy, and so on, who perform religious services for other groups. In fact, many elders are restricted from entrance to an institution depending on the accompanying paperwork forwarded to the main security by the Aboriginal liaison. Further, the allocation of time to provide spiritual services in the form of sweat lodges, teachings, ceremonies, and cultural counseling verges on minimal and insufficient at best. In most if not all, institutions providing custody for Aboriginal women prisoners. This is the reality. These cultural and spiritual services, which are a right for federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners, are provided at the whim of CSC, and with further approval and intervention with individual institution levels, thereby negating the intent of the provision of the Commissioner's directive identified as CD 702. The disadvantages of allowing federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners to remain within federal correctional facilities include the failure of CSC to provide meaningful programming and services leading to the reintegration into Aboriginal communities in Canadian society, the disproportionate labeling of federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners as maximum security, and the harsh treatment that this entails, the disproportionate housing of federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners in men's federal prisons with little access to common areas and meaningful programming. And CSC has told us that they will be housing the maximum security women within the women's prisons when the new maximum security units are up and running. However, if you look at the projection of numbers of female prisoners, the new facilities will not be housing them for long. And generally speaking, when that happens, the women get put back into the branches of the men's prisons. A disproportionately high number of federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners have committed violent crimes, including assault, assisted suicide, while they have been incarcerated. A disproportionately high number of federally sentenced Aboriginal women have committed suicide in prison. A disproportionately high number of federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners begin age. You go to the maximum security unit at Sask Pen, and the last time I was there, there were 17 women in the facility, maximum security facility. Of the 17, 15 of them were Aboriginal women, and of the 17, 15 were under the age of 25. Some of these young women have committed violent crimes while in the system as a result of being in the system, and are serving life sentences. We have one example of a woman serving a sentence in the Sask Pen at this point. She went in at 17 doing a 3-year sentence. She's now doing a life sentence. She's 43, has not been out. Just a brief comment on the fiduciary trust owed to the Aboriginal women. It's NWAC's position that Canada is in a fiduciary trust responsibility or relationship with all federally sentenced women. In addition, Canada owes a duty to federally sentenced Aboriginal women and a legal fiduciary responsibility to them under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 and under Section 9124 of the Constitution Act 1867. And it's the Native Women's Association of Canada's position that Canada is in breach of that duty. An example of the breach, further breach of that duty, is that all status Indians in Canada that are recognized under the Indian Act are eligible to access their treaty rights or rights, which are often provided in the forms of health care, including dental, eye care, education, and overall welfare. While incarcerated, these treaty rights are suspended to federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners without the right to appeal. And that means that a federally sentenced Aboriginal woman who, if they were not incarcerated would have the right to eye examinations, glasses provided at no cost to them as by their treaty right, dental work, medical prescriptions provided to them at no cost because of their treaty rights, cannot access that while they're incarcerated. And they're subjected to the care inside the institution that is wholly inadequate. In conclusion, NWAC sees some of the remedies for the breaches that the Correction Services of Canada have perpetuated on the Aboriginal women, that federally sentenced Aboriginal women can be decarcerated and released for supervision to Aboriginal communities under Section 81 and 84 of the CCRA. The Human Resources Development Corporation expends millions of dollars for training of Indian, Métis, and Inuit annually, and have done so organizations for over 10 years. In cooperation with CSC, HRDC, some of these training and job creation dollars could be used by Aboriginal communities to train personnel to work with Aboriginal offenders, particularly women, within Aboriginal communities. Correction Services Canada has the authority under Sections 81 to 84 to facilitate and fund capacity building in Aboriginal communities to facilitate reintegration of federally sentenced Aboriginal women back into Aboriginal society. This can include the building of facilities such as the one constructed on Indian land at Maple Creek, Saskatchewan. The initial investment of CSC in constructing the facility was in excess of $8 million, and it funds the full operation of the facility on Indian land. Another healing lodge for Aboriginal men was built using CSC funds on Indian land near Edmonton, Alberta, to house at least 35 male Aboriginal offenders. The utilization of homelessness dollars currently being allocated to urban and typically non-Aboriginal community could also be directed to assist in the endeavor within urban centers. Given that 10 years have expired since Sections 81 and 84 were last amended to give federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners the right to consent to supervision in Aboriginal communities and to give Aboriginal communities notice and time to prepare plans for the reintegration of federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners, with little being done, it is time to make those sections of the CCRA operational. It is clear CSC must take a lead role in policy and procedure development, as well as planning of budgets to train personnel in Aboriginal communities to supervise the federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners. The concept of Aboriginal-specific private home placement model, which would provide federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners and the Aboriginal community with the opportunity to plan and actualize the concepts of Sections 81 and 84 of the CCRA through proactive funding within Aboriginal communities. NWAC recognizes that CSC has no expertise in Aboriginal women's issues or in what federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners need in order to reintegrate successfully back into society. NWAC has been asked sporadically to help Correction Services Canada with this. They came to the Native Women's Association of Canada when they needed an Aboriginal woman to represent the Aboriginal women on the task force. They came to the Native Women's Association of Canada when they started to implement the Making Choices document, and they started building or planning to build the 5 facilities. And they came to Native Women's Association of Canada and said, "We don't know what to do about the Healing Lodge. Can you help us?" And the Native Women's Association of Canada at that point said, "We will under one condition, if we can have control over the project." And they turned the project over to us. And we set up the planning circle model. And the Native Women's Association of Canada facilitated the members of that planning circle. And the Correction Service of Canada was not pleased with the the size of the planning circle, as we needed proper representation from various sectors. But they agreed to fund it, which they did, and they also were not pleased with the size because they said it would take us a long time to have the lodge operational, because in addition to having a very large planning circle, we insisted that the planning circle operate by consensus. We had several members of the Correction Service of Canada on that planning circle, but in order for us to move ahead with the construction and opening of the lodge, every decision had to be cut by consensus. We could not take a vote at the table. And they told us it would take too long for us to build a consensus. We started 18 months behind the planning of the rest of the facilities, and we were the second one up and running. So when you have a group of people focusing on not on the power of the individual in the circle, but always taking a decision on what is best for the federally sentenced women that will be housed there and what is best for the project, it was very easy to come to a consensus. NWAC proposes the establishment of the office headed by the Aboriginal women lawyer / judge / criminologist, supported by CSC staff and Aboriginal professionals, to remedy the breach by CSC and the Crown of its fiduciary duty to Aboriginal women prisoners. NWAC recommends the establishment of a national body comprised of national, regional, and First Nation territory Aboriginal women's organizations with the authority to direct CSC operations which affect federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners. Native Women's Association of Canada recognizes that CSC does not have the expertise to do that. And Native Women's Association of Canada that recognizes that despite CSC's good intentions, they cannot, within their structure, plan or implement anything that's to the benefit of the federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners, that they need to have an organization, a body outside of CSC that has the authority to direct what's going on with the federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners. The Native Women's Association of Canada recommends the re-establishment of the Okama-Ochi Healing Lodge, Gigawan-Kanawak, the Keepers of the Vision, as the council responsible for the operation of the lodge. That is the only way to bring the lodge back to a position where it might benefit federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners. At this point, it cannot do that. The Native Women's Association of Canada requests the immediate information on the status of the federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners serving time at Burnaby Provincial Correctional Facility and plans for their movement to other facilities. The Native Women's Association of Canada recommends the funding of programs and services to be delivered to the federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners' needs to be provided in the form of resources to Aboriginal community under the premise of by, for, and about Aboriginal women. Culture and identity are essential components to assist the federally sentenced Aboriginal women prisoners in reclaiming their identity as Aboriginal and to begin to repair the damage caused from colonization oppression, which have played a huge factor, in the criminalization of Aboriginal women. In essence, the Native Women's Association of Canada is requesting and expecting the Canadian Human Rights Commission to think outside the box created by the Canadian society and government policy. We're asking you to raise the human existence and viability of Aboriginal women, and particularly Aboriginal women prisoners, rather than continue to impose upon us the values, perceptions, and differential, marginalized, and racial infringements typically experienced within Canadian society and federal penal system by Aboriginal women. Thanks.